The rhythmic hum of the grocery store's air conditioning was one of the few constants in Evelyn Carter's life. At 53, she had come to rely on her weekly trips to Stockwell's market to punctuate the monotony of her days. Mondays were for cleaning, Tuesdays for volunteering at the library, and Wednesdays for stocking her modest pantry. It was a routine that provided comfort in its predictability, even if it lacked excitement. Pushing her cart through the produce aisle, Evelyn adjusted her glasses and picked up a head of lettuce. She examined it with care, noting the crispness of its leaves before placing it gently in her basket. It wasn't until she turned to reach for a bag of apples that she noticed him. He was crouched by the citrus display, inspecting a grapefruit with an intensity that made her pause. His face was youthful, perhaps 30 at most, with a mess of dark hair that fell into his eyes as he furrowed his brow in concentration. There was something endearing about the way he handled the fruit, as though he were solving a puzzle. "Are you always this serious about grapefruit?" The words left her mouth before she could think better of it. He looked up, startled, and then laughed, a rich, warm sound that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "I like to think of it as thoroughness," he replied, standing to his full height. He was taller than she'd realized, with a presence that was both unassuming and magnetic. "You never know when you might end up with a dud." Evelyn smiled despite herself. "That's a level of caution I can respect." "I'm Leo, by the way," he said, offering his hand. "Evelyn," she replied, taking it. His grip was firm but gentle, and she felt a strange flicker of connection in the brief contact. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, their conversation didn't end there. They stood in the produce aisle, discussing everything from seasonal fruits to the quirks of small-town grocery stores. Leo's humor was quick, his energy infectious, and Evelyn found herself laughing in a way she hadn't in years. When they finally parted ways, her with her basket of carefully chosen vegetables, him with his prized grapefruit, Evelyn felt an odd lightness in her chest. It was a fleeting moment, she told herself, a pleasant exchange with a stranger. Yet as she drove home and unpacked her groceries, she couldn't shake the memory of his smile or the warmth of his voice. That night, as she sat by her window with a book she wasn't reading, Evelyn realized something startling. For the first time in years, her quiet, predictable life didn't feel as comforting as it once had. And it was all because of a stranger who cared deeply about grapefruit. The next week, Evelyn found herself lingering a bit longer in the produce aisle than usual. She told herself it was a coincidence, that she wasn't waiting for anyone in particular. But when she heard that familiar warm voice call out, "Back for round 2 with the lettuce," her heart lifted in a way she hadn't expected. She turned to find Leo grinning at her, a basket of avocados in his hand. "I like to think I'm thorough," she quipped, echoing his words from their first meeting. It became a pattern after that. They'd bump into each other at Stockwell's, their conversations picking up where they had left off. Over time, the exchanges grew longer, the topics deeper. Evelyn learned that Leo was a freelance photographer, drawn to their small town by its historic architecture and quiet charm. He told her about his love of capturing unguarded moments, the stories he saw in the faces of strangers. In turn, she shared pieces of herself, slowly at first, then more freely as his presence began to feel familiar. She told him about her late husband, about the 2 grown children who lived states away, and about the quiet life she had built for herself in their absence. It was a life she had always considered content, but one that now felt as though it had been waiting for something, or someone to disrupt it. Their interactions extended beyond the grocery store. One afternoon, Leo invited her to join him for coffee at a nearby cafe. Over steaming cups, they swapped stories of travels, his filled with spontaneity and adventure, hers carefully planned family vacations that now felt distant and sepia-toned. She found herself captivated by the way he saw the world, his youthful optimism a sharp contrast to her own cautious practicality. When he showed her some of his photos on his phone, images of sunlit streets, weathered hands clutching market bags, a child's laughter frozen in time, she saw the beauty he so effortlessly found in the everyday. It made her wonder when she had stopped noticing such things in her own life. Small, thoughtful gestures became a part of their growing connection. Leo once brought her a pint of fresh strawberries he'd found at the farmer's market, claiming they were too perfect not to share. Another time, Evelyn baked him a batch of oatmeal cookies, shyly handing over the tin with the excuse that it was just a little something she had lying around. In Leo's presence, Evelyn began to notice changes in herself. Her laughter came more easily. She looked forward to the days she knew she might see him. The monotony of her routine softened, replaced by the quiet thrill of anticipation. Yet, amidst the joy, there was a whisper of caution in her mind. She reminded herself of their age difference, of the societal lines she felt were drawn firmly in the sand. She told herself they were just friends, kindred spirits who had stumbled into each other's lives. Still, when she lay in bed at night, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, she couldn't help but wonder. What was it about Leo that made her feel as though she were waking up from a long sleep? And why, despite her better judgment, did she hope their paths would continue to cross? It happened one late afternoon as they strolled through the park, a bag of breadcrumbs in hand for the ducks that gathered around the pond. The sun hung low, casting a golden glow over the water, and Evelyn found herself marveling at how natural it felt to be here with Leo, as though this moment had always been waiting for them. He was telling her about his latest project, his voice alive with enthusiasm. "It's about finding stories in the mundane," he explained, gesturing animatedly. "Like that old man on the bench with his crossword. I bet he's been coming here every day for years. Or that couple over there. See how they lean toward each other? That's decades of love right there." Evelyn smiled, watching the way his eyes lit up as he spoke. "You see the world differently," she said softly. "I think that's what I like most about you." He turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "And what about you, Evelyn? What do you see when you look at the world?" She hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I suppose I see the way things have settled. Patterns. Routines. The way life just sort of fits into place after a while." Leo tilted his head, his gaze steady. "But don't you ever want to shake it up? To break out of those patterns?" The question lingered in the air, heavier than she expected. Before she could answer, a group of ducks swarmed them, eager for the crumbs in Leo's hand. He laughed, scattering the bread with an ease that made her chest ache. It wasn't until later that evening, as she replayed the day in her mind, that Evelyn felt it, a sudden, undeniable realization. She had been thinking about Leo more than she cared to admit. It wasn't just his laughter or the stories he told. It was the way he made her feel alive, as though her days were no longer something to endure but to savor. The thought unsettled her. She was 53. He was in his early 30s. What was she thinking? Was she really allowing herself to feel this? Evelyn sat in her favorite chair by the window, her hands clutching a mug of chamomile tea that had long since gone cold. Her reflection stared back at her in the darkened glass, a mixture of curiosity and fear in her eyes. She tried to rationalize it, to chalk it up to a midlife fantasy or a fleeting sense of gratitude for the companionship he had brought into her life. But the truth was undeniable. Her feelings for Leo had grown deeper than friendship. And now, she was left to grapple with the enormity of it. Her heart ached with the weight of her own thoughts. What would he think if he knew? Did he see her the same way, or was she simply a kind older friend, a mentor figure in his vibrant, youthful life? And even if he did feel the same, what would people say? What would her children think? She closed her eyes, the question swirling in her mind like a storm. For years, she had lived her life within carefully drawn boundaries, avoiding risks, avoiding vulnerability. And now, in the span of a few weeks, one young man had upended everything she thought she knew about herself. Evelyn sighed, leaning her head back against the chair. Whatever this was, it wasn't something she could simply push aside. The feelings were there, blooming despite her fears, and she knew she couldn't ignore them for much longer. The days that followed were a tangle of emotions for Evelyn. She vacillated between elation and dread, her feelings for Leo like a secret she didn't know how to hold. When they were together, the world felt brighter, her laughter freer. But when she was alone, the doubts crept in, heavy and persistent. What if she was making a fool of herself? What if he only saw her as a passing connection, a curiosity in his otherwise youthful world? She pictured the whispers of others if they ever discovered the truth. The idea of being judged, mocked even, for daring to feel this way at her age gnawed at her relentlessly. Still, she couldn't help but cherish the moments they shared. Their walks in the park, their impromptu coffee dates, even their grocery store encounters, All of it felt so easy, so natural. Leo's presence awakened a part of her that she thought had long since faded. It wasn't just his youth. It was his spirit, the way he looked at life with unbridled curiosity and unshakable hope. One evening, Evelyn found herself flipping through an old photo album, the pages filled with memories of a life that felt both near and distant. There were pictures of her wedding day, her children as toddlers, family vacations where everyone smiled for the camera. She had loved deeply then, but that love had come with expectations, obligations. What she felt for Leo was different, unpredictable, untamed, and thrilling in a way that scared her. It wasn't rooted in a shared history but in a connection she couldn't quite explain. Her mind was at war with her heart. Logic told her to let it go, to preserve the simplicity of their friendship, and avoid the risk of heartbreak. But her heart, reckless and hopeful, whispered otherwise. Why shouldn't she feel this way? Why shouldn't she allow herself the chance to love again, even if it defied convention? One morning, as she stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window above the counter. She studied her face, the faint lines around her eyes, the silver streaks in her hair, the subtle softness of her jawline. She saw a woman who had lived, who had weathered joy and loss, who had earned every moment of her 53 years. But she also saw someone who wasn't ready to let the years define her. Evelyn realized that her fear wasn't just about Leo, it was about what she thought she deserved. Somewhere along the way, she had convinced herself that her time for love had passed, that her role now was to fade quietly into the background while others lived out the dreams she had already fulfilled. But what if that wasn't true? What if love didn't have an age limit? Her hand stilled under the running water as the thoughts settled into her heart. She didn't have all the answers, far from it. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't need them yet. For now it was enough to admit what she felt. The rest, she decided, would come in time. The idea first came to Evelyn as she rearranged a vase of sunflowers on her dining table. She had bought them impulsively during a morning trip to the farmer's market, their vibrant yellows brightening her otherwise neutral-toned kitchen. As she adjusted the stems, her thoughts drifted, as they often did now, to Leo. Would he like the flowers? She imagined him walking into her home, his curious eyes scanning the room, taking in the subtle pieces of her life. A sudden image of him sitting across from her at the table, his hand brushing against hers, sent a jolt of warmth through her chest. The notion of inviting him over felt audacious. For weeks, they had met on neutral ground. The grocery store, the cafe, the park. Her home, however, was different. It was personal, intimate, a space she rarely shared with anyone. Yet the more she thought about it, the more the idea took root. What excuse could she use? Evelyn's mind sifted through possibilities as she absently wiped the already spotless kitchen counter. She could cook dinner. Yes, that seemed innocent enough. She could invite him to sample her late husband's prized wine collection, still sitting untouched in the cellar. Or perhaps she could claim she needed help with her garden. After all, Leo had mentioned he liked working with his hands. But what if he declined? The thought filled her with dread. Worse, what if he misread her intentions? Or read them all too well? Evelyn sat down heavily at the table, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. She felt like a teenager contemplating her first date. The mix of anticipation and anxiety almost unbearable. It was ridiculous, she told herself. Why was she putting so much weight on this? She had hosted countless dinners and gatherings over the years. Why should this feel any different? Because it was different. She knew that. This wasn't about politeness or routine socializing. This was a step toward something new, something unknown. And it terrified her. She thought back to Leo's question in the park. Don't you ever want to shake it up? The memory gave her courage. Life had been predictable for so long. Maybe it was time to let a little unpredictability in. Later that evening, she picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over Leo's name in her contacts. Her heart thudded in her chest as she typed a message, erasing it twice before settling on something casual. Hi Leo, I've been experimenting with a new dinner recipe and would love some honest feedback. Are you free Friday evening? She hit send before she could overthink it, staring at the screen as if willing it to respond. Seconds stretched into minutes, and just as she began to doubt herself, the phone buzzed. Sounds great. What time should I come by? Evelyn exhaled, her nerves giving way to a bubbling sense of excitement. Friday couldn't come soon enough. The night of the dinner arrived with a quiet certainty that Evelyn couldn't shake. She had spent the afternoon preparing the meal: roasted chicken with rosemary, a fresh green salad, and a decadent chocolate cake for dessert. Her kitchen smelled warm and inviting, the kind of homey comfort she had always associated with family dinners, though this time the table would be set for only two. She adjusted the place settings, her hands moving mechanically as she tried to settle the nervous flutter in her stomach. The flowers she had arranged earlier were still vibrant, their yellow petals catching the soft light of the dining room. She had even set the table with her finest china, another indulgence, though she had no real reason to do so. She simply wanted the evening to feel special, to honor the moment. When the doorbell rang, Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She took a deep breath before walking to the door, opening it to find Leo standing on the other side, dressed casually in a fitted jacket and jeans. The familiar warmth of his smile hit her immediately, and it was like a weight lifted from her chest. "Evening," Leo greeted her, his voice smooth and relaxed, but with a hint of excitement. "I must admit, I've been looking forward to this all week." "Come in," Evelyn said, stepping aside to let him in. Her breath caught in her throat as their eyes met, an unspoken tension hanging in the air between them. She quickly ushered him toward the dining room, her mind racing with questions. Would it feel awkward? Would their connection shift under the weight of this new context? But as they settled into their seats, the conversation flowed easily. Leo complimented the meal, telling her it smelled incredible, and they began to talk as if no time had passed since their last encounter. The comfort of their shared history, however brief, was palpable, but now it felt different. There was an intimacy in the air that hadn't been there before. They discussed everything and nothing, their laughter filling the space between bites. At one point, Leo leaned forward, his eyes sparkling. "I think this might be the best chicken I've ever had," he said, genuinely impressed. Evelyn felt a flush of pride, but it was more than that. It was a connection she hadn't realized she was craving. She had spent so many years being the one to care for others, but here she was, allowing herself to be seen, allowing herself to enjoy the simple act of being shared. When the conversation paused, the room seemed to breathe in unison. She looked at Leo, really looked at him, in a way she hadn't before. He was more than a kind stranger or a young man she had met by chance. He was someone she could imagine in her life, not just in fleeting moments, but in the everyday, in the quiet corners of her existence. Leo noticed her gaze and held it for a moment, the air between them growing thicker with something unsaid. Then, as if reading her thoughts, he offered a soft smile, one that reached his eyes, and said, "I'm glad you invited me here tonight, Evelyn. It feels right, somehow." Evelyn felt her heart skip. It wasn't the words, but the way he said them, the sincerity, the openness. She had been so afraid of what inviting him into her home would mean, but now, sitting across from him, she understood that this was exactly where she was meant to be. As the evening wore on, they moved from dinner to the small living room, where Leo admired a few of her antique pieces, carefully curated over the years. He admired them not in the way of a visitor, but with genuine interest, as if they were part of the story that made up her life. The way he looked at her home, at the things she had built, felt like an unspoken declaration of understanding. When they finally said goodnight, standing on the doorstep, Leo turned to her, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "This was really great," he said, his voice softening. "Thank you for inviting me. I wasn't sure what to expect, but now, I don't know. It just feels like we've always done this." Evelyn smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. "It does, doesn't it?" she replied, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions inside. She hesitated for just a moment before adding, "I'm glad you came, Leo." "Really glad." He nodded, his eyes lingering on hers, and then, before he left, he placed a gentle hand on her arm, his fingers brushing her skin with the lightest of touches. "I'll see you soon," he said, his words a promise. As he walked away, Evelyn stood in the doorway, her hand still where he had touched her. She closed the door quietly behind her, leaning against it for a moment, her heart full of things she wasn't quite ready to understand yet. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the need to. The days that followed were quieter, more contemplative. Evelyn found herself replaying the evening over and over in her mind, each moment, each glance, each word shared between them. What had started as a casual dinner had somehow unfolded into something more, something deeper, and something she couldn't fully grasp, though she longed to. It wasn't just about Leo anymore. It was about her, too. The way she had allowed herself to feel wanted, to feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. The way her body had reacted to his presence. How her heart had quickened at his smile. How her fingers had itched to reach out and touch him, to bridge the gap between them. Sitting in her favorite armchair one quiet afternoon, Evelyn found herself staring at a family photograph, her gaze lingering on the smiling faces of her children, now grown and scattered across the country. She hadn't seen them in months. It had always been a habit of hers, to retreat into herself, to withdraw when things became too overwhelming. Yet, with Leo, there was no need to retreat. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that it wasn't just his youth that stirred her, it was his willingness to meet her, to see her as she was, without pretense, without the weight of expectations that so often came with relationships her age. She had spent years building walls, convincing herself that love was something for the young, for those who still had the luxury of time ahead of them. But now she was beginning to see how wrong she had been. Love didn't belong to any one age. It wasn't confined to a stage of life, nor was it about chasing a fleeting moment of youth. It was about connection, about the unexpected recognition of kindred spirits, no matter how different their paths had been. She thought back to the questions that had haunted her the night she had invited him over. What will people say? What will my children think? She had been so caught up in the idea of judgment, society's judgment, her own, that she had almost let it steal the joy of what was unfolding between them. But now, sitting in her own home, with the sun dipping low through the window, Evelyn felt a growing sense of liberation. She was who she was, and she had the right to love who she loved. Age was just a number, a societal construct that had little bearing on the heart's desires. For the first time in years, she wasn't just a mother or a daughter or a widow. She was a woman, full and whole, capable of deep and passionate love, no matter how many years had passed. There was a freedom in that realization. She had no idea where this connection with Leo might lead, no idea if it would continue to grow, or if it was merely a beautiful chapter that would fade with time. But she didn't need to know. For the first time in a long time, she was content to simply be present in the moment, to savor the feeling of being alive in a way that felt both new and wonderfully familiar. Love, she reflected, didn't always make sense. But it didn't need to. It only needed to be real. And for once, Evelyn wasn't afraid to let it be. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping her from her thoughts. She glanced at it to see a message from Leo. "Hey, I was thinking, maybe we could grab a coffee tomorrow. Just the two of us." She smiled, her heart fluttering. It felt like a promise. A simple, unspoken promise that no matter where this path might lead, she would walk it without fear. "That sounds wonderful," she typed back. "I'll be there." As she hit send, Evelyn realized that, for the first time in a long while, she was looking forward to something, and it had nothing to do with routine, or expectations, or the way things were supposed to be. It was just love, pure and unfiltered. And it was hers to embrace. As Evelyn sat across from Leo at the cafe the next afternoon, sipping her coffee with a newfound calm. She couldn't help but feel a deep sense of contentment settle over her. There was something undeniably special about this quiet moment between them, about the way Leo looked at her with such open curiosity, as if every word she spoke held meaning. It was in these small exchanges that she felt alive, truly alive, in a way she hadn't in years. The world around them seemed to blur, the hum of other conversations and clinking cups fading into the background as they simply were. They were no longer two people bound by the silence of their own lives. They were two souls, drawn together by an unspoken connection that needed no explanation. She knew that she didn't need to justify their relationship to anyone. Not to her friends, not to her family, and certainly not to society. "You seem at peace," Leo said softly, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup, a thoughtful expression in his eyes. "What changed?" Evelyn smiled, her gaze drifting to the window, watching the golden light of late afternoon filter through the trees outside. It was a question she had asked herself many times over the past few weeks, and for the first time, she had an answer. I think I've finally realized that love doesn't have a timeline, she said, her voice steady and calm, but filled with an undeniable truth. It's not about age or who we were, or where we thought we were going. It's about who we are right now. And right now, I feel like I'm exactly where I need to be. Leo nodded, his smile warm and understanding. I'm glad to hear that. I feel the same way. They sat there for a while longer, not needing words to fill the space between them. Their bond, so tender and new, had blossomed in ways neither of them could have anticipated, and it felt right. It felt like the start of something beautiful, something that didn't need to be defined by conventional measures. Evelyn had spent so many years worrying about what she had lost, what she had missed. But now, as she looked into Leo's eyes, she understood that she wasn't chasing something she had once had. She was embracing something entirely new, a kind of love that didn't care about time or expectations, one that simply existed in the present, raw and unfiltered. Love, she realized, was something that could find us at any stage of life. It wasn't reserved for the young or the naive. It was for those who were brave enough to allow themselves to feel it, no matter the circumstances. And she was ready to feel it, ready to let go of the fear, the doubt, the shame, and simply embrace what was in front of her, an unexpected love that had arrived when she least expected it but had come to stay. As they left the cafe together, Evelyn's heart was light, free of the old burdens that had once weighed it down. She knew that the road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid to walk it. With Leo by her side, she would face whatever came next, knowing that love wasn't something to fear. It was something to cherish,